Good evening everyone. Good evening. My name is Dr. Raymond Covington, and I'm the President and CEO of Weeksville Heritage Center. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, staff, and supporters, welcome to Weeksville. Hello, Dr. Cole. Mr. Stanton, James Stanton, welcome. And welcome to the Joan Maynard Lecture Series. This series honors Dr. Joan Maynard, a central and iconic figure in the institution's history by spotlighting contemporary thinkers whose work addresses issues pertinent to the Black community. An artist, noted preservationist, and community organizer, Dr. Joan Maynard led Weeksville Heritage Center for over 25 years, from its inception in 1974 to her retirement in 1999. And I could not think of a better way to start the lecture series than bringing Dr. Cole. I'll give you a brief personal reflection on Dr. Cole, my brief personal reflection. I'll read her official bio, and then I'll pass the mic, as they say, to the good doctor. Johnnetta Cole is a special kind of scholar, researcher, pioneer, and person. The way in which she has framed sheroes, her stories, has not only made us rethink gender, but also made us rethink academic disciplines, approaches to work in cultural institutions and museums, university leadership, and DEIA work. I'm grown, and I'm still trying to be like Dr. Cole, or be dumb enough to call the Dr. C. But I'm from an era where we didn't call our ageless elders by their first name. Frankly, it would be weird for me to call you Johnnetta, so I'll keep it to Dr. Cole, because that just feels right. It's with reverence that we invited you here, and we're glad that you're here with us. And I feel like you should have been here before, and I'm wondering why we didn't get you here before and what took us so long. But the important thing is that you're here now with us. As a fellow anthropologist, I have followed Dr. Cole's work since graduate school. And I was in graduate school a long time ago with the emphasis on long. With that said, it was important for us to have the inaugural speaker of the Joan Maynard Lecture Series be someone who could pull together the strands of history, race, gender, and power, and to be able to make the connection between Weeksville's past and present, as well as someone who could do this from an academic, community, and personal perspective. So when we started thinking about speakers, I quickly thought, I got somebody. Let me see if they're interested. I'm so glad you said yes. But before moving on, I'd like to thank our staff here at Weeksville for their hard work in helping us organize this event. Erica Harper, Emer Hughes, John Murray, Rachel Tomping, Reggie Glenn, Tony Thompson. And with that said, I'd like to read Dr. Cole's official bio. And I'd also like to welcome those that are joining us in remote land, online, through Zoom. Welcome. Johnnetta Cole is a noted anthropologist, educator, author, speaker, and consultant on inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility in educational institutions, museums, corporations, and other workplaces. And I have to say, this is probably the most modest bio I've read in a while. Just keep that in mind. After receiving a PhD in anthropology, Dr. Cole held teaching positions in anthropology, women's studies, and African American studies at several colleges and universities. Dr. Cole served as president of both historically Black colleges for women in the United States, Spelman College and Bennett College, a distinction she alone holds. She also served as the director of the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art, as a principal consultant, and as a principal consultant at Cook Ross, and as a senior consulting fellow at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Continuing her long involvement in community service in 2004, Dr. Cole was the first African-American woman to serve as the chair of the board of United Way of America. She recently served in the voluntary position of chair of the board and seventh president of the National Council of Negro Women. She is an emerita member of the board of the Dr. Maya Angelou Foundation. Currently, she serves on the board of the A.O. Lewis on Historic American Beach in Fernandina Beach, Florida. Dr. Cole has served on corporate boards of Coca-Cola Enterprises, Home Depot, Merck, and Nations Bank South. She was the first woman appointed to the board of Coca-Cola Enterprises and the first Black woman appointed to Merck's board of directors. Dr. Cole has co-authored and edited several books and numerous articles for scholarly and general audiences. Her latest publications are Racism in American Public Life, The Call to Action in 2021, published in 2021, and African Proverbs for All Ages, also published in 2021. Dr. Cole has received numerous awards and is the recipient of 70, yes, 70, honorary degrees. So I would imagine that you probably run out of wall space. Somebody, all these honorary degrees, well deserved. Throughout her career and in her published work, speeches, and community service, Dr. Cole consistently addresses issues of racism, sexism, and all other systems of inequality. She's a mentor to people of different identities and cultures, and I will humbly include myself as a member of this group. And as some of you may know, on March 21st, Dr. Cole received the National Medal of Arts and the National Medal of Arts and National Humanities Medal from President Biden. The question for me is, since then, have you received any other honors? You don't know about it? So great. So with that said, I'd like to bring Dr. Cole to the podium for a lecture, entitled appropriately enough, Why African American History, Culture, Art Should Matter to All Americans. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Johnnetta Cole.
My sisters, my brothers, my siblings all. And I do have a very special greeting for my spellbound sister. Now, I have warmly greeted each of you using kinship terms. And I think I need to explain myself. Because as far as I know, the only person here to whom or with whom I have a kinship tie, and it is through marriage, is with James D. Staten Jr. So why am I addressing you as my kinfolk? Well, because the discipline that I was trained in, anthropology, taught me that kinship is about more than descent or blood or marriage. Kinship is really about shared values, and it is about caring about and caring for each other. I assume that we are kinfolk because you are here, because you must in some way value the Weeksville Heritage Center, a place that works at that very critical intersection of history and art and culture. And because, Sister Board Member, I also value the work of the Weeksville Heritage Center, that too makes us kinfolk. Now, I do want to take a moment to express my gratitude to Brother President and CEO Raymond Carrington. It is he who invited me here, as he has just shared with you. Now, while I have not served as one of his direct anthropology mentors, I am pleased to be in that community and of that generation of his mentors, including our beloved sister, who's up there in glory somewhere, the great Dr. Lee. Because of Raymond Carrington's scholarship, his prior experiences in leadership roles, and certainly because of his commitment to social justice, y'all are mighty fortunate to have him at the helm of this center. I also want to express my gratitude for this opportunity to give a lecture that carries the name of Dr. Joan Maynard. Now, I didn't have the privilege of working with Joan Cooper Baptist Maynard, but I certainly know of her good work. I know that she was a noted and beloved artist and preservationist. And so on this 24th day of Women's Her Story Month, let us all pay homage to our hero, Joan Maynard. The title that I chose for this talk is a response to current attacks that are being lodged against the teaching of African American studies, the teaching of our history and our art and our culture in our country's schools, colleges, and universities. I chose this title because I feel so strongly that this kind of education must take place. Education about who we are, and as our people would say, whose we are. And it is information, it is knowledge that must be communicated, not only from us, among us, and to other generations below us in age, but to all Americans. Because of the profoundly brutal nature of our enslavement, and certainly because of systemic racism, we Black Americans were brought here and literally separated purposefully from our history and our culture. At least those who enslaved us tried. But Africa's people found a way, as we must continue to find a way, to tell our stories. But because of enslavement, there is so much about our individual families that we do not know. I think we're all becoming far more sophisticated now about how you go on Ancestry.com and you find out about your mama and your grandma and your granddaddy and those before. And so as you listen to this talk that I have chosen to center on recounting my story, it's the first time I've ever done this. Recounting my story of my paternal and my maternal ancestors. I want you to remember that such information about African American history and culture is being called by individuals on the far right of the political continuum. They are calling it woke indoctrination that can harm children, that can make white people feel uncomfortable. And some go so far as to saying that teaching African American history and culture is un-American. Indeed, some stories about the lives of some Black folks, including as told in children's books, that information is now being banned. Well, my sisters, my brothers, my siblings all, I'm going to tell my story. And I'm here to urge you to tell yours. Telling the history and her story of my ancestors is certainly connected to my training as an anthropologist. anthropologist, but it is fundamentally driven by the fact that I am a social justice activist. My knowledge about my paternal side of my family is very sparse, but I am in the process of researching this side of my story. My father, John Thomas Betch Sr., was the only child born to Mattie Betch, a black woman, and John J. Betch, a biracial man who was the son of a German man and a black woman. There's information about my paternal grandparents that's recorded under the heading of Tourist Home in 1940 and 1941 entries in the Green Book. Anybody know about the Green Book? Aha! A publication then, as you know, that was used during the days of racial segregation and discrimination to inform African American folk, since they couldn't stay in white folks' hotels and motels, to inform us of safe places where black people lived. An entry in the Green Book says this: Mrs. Mattie B. Betch operated the tourist home at her residence located at 2019 Rock Spring Street in Henderson, North Carolina. Mattie Betch, my paternal grandmother, was born in 1876 in Halifax, North Carolina. In 1895, she married John Kelly, who died shortly after that marriage. And so in 1900, she married my paternal grandfather, John Jacob Betch. Their two children were my father, John Thomas Betch, and an adopted daughter, Cleo Betch. Now you know about black folk and our adoption. You don't have to have no papers. You just need a child that needs you. My paternal grandfather was a prominent brick mason. He was also the founding vice president of the Henderson chapter of the National Negro Business League. And so it is he who built their home, his home with my paternal grandmother. A 1940 Green Book listing says this: their home had 3,569 feet. There were 7 bedrooms, 2 baths. When we were young children, my sister, whose given name was Marvine Elizabeth Betch, and I, we would spend summers at Grandma Betch's home in Henderson, North Carolina. So on one occasion, I said, Grandma Betch, why is it you get us up so early in the morning? She answered, so you can get your beds made. We got our beds made, and then came the chores, including, of course, harvesting vegetables from Grandma Betch's garden. I remember those lunches. It seems to me every day lunch was white bread, spread. Do you all remember this? If you do, you're going to tell your age. Spread with sandwich spread. Remember that? Mayonnaise with pickles and I don't know what else. Now, compared to what I have shared with you about my paternal side of the family, an enormous amount has been written about the maternal side of my family, including very serious scholarly work by Dr. Daniel Schaefer, a retired scholar from the University of Florida, Gainesville. Let me begin to tell you that story. On June 18, 1793, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother was born into a royal Wolof family. Wolof people who lived in what is today on the west coast of Africa, the country called Senegal. She was given the name Anta Majijin Jai. When Anta was 13 years old, she was captured, put in shackles, taken to the island of Gorée, which is off of the main country, off of the coast of Senegal. There she was put into what is known as a slave pen until the time came for her to be pushed through the door of no return into a ship for enslaved people. I have stood in that door of no return on Gorée Island, and I have wept. I have wept as I thought about the women, the men, the children enslaved by other human beings. Anta was off-boarded in Havana, Cuba. She was put on an auction block where she was examined by potential buyers as if she was from a herd of cattle. Zephaniah Kingsley, a 43-year-old British enslaver, had traveled to Havana, Cuba, for the explicit purpose of buying people. He had come from his plantation in what was then a Spanish colony in southeast Florida that is on Fort George Island. That is land that was taken from the indigenous Timacon people. The Kingsley Plantation, which is a 25-mile trip from where my husband and I now live, is currently under the guardianship of the National Park Service. When Zephaniah Kingsley saw and examined Anta Majijin Jai, he bought her. And before by ship they reached his plantation in Florida, he had impregnated that 13-year-old girl. He had some very, very peculiar attitudes about enslavement. He said it was really all right to own other people as long as they were treated well. He himself had a common law marriage with 4 enslaved women. In 1811, when Anta Majijin Jai turned 18 years old, Zephaniah Kingsley freed her and gave her responsibilities for his plantation. Now, I believe that if you're going to tell a story, you got to tell the whole story. And so that is why I must tell you, not that I am proud of this, indeed I am not, But I must tell you that my maternal ancestor, Auntie Kingsley, once she gained her freedom, owned 12 enslaved people. After the United States gained control of Florida from the Spanish, the discriminatory laws threatened the multiracial Kingsley family. And so most of them moved to a part of Haiti that later became the Dominican Republic. White family members, they were. Black family members, they were. Mixed race family members, they were. And while the family was living, again in that part of Haiti that later became the Dominican Republic, Kingsley died. Zephaniah Kingsley died. At that point, Auntie Kingsley returned to Florida, where she had to fight with her common law husband's white relatives who were contesting his will so that they could exclude her and her children from their inheritance. Because the court honored a treaty between the United States and Spain, Auntie Jai Kingsley won her court case, despite the hostile political climate toward black people. She settled in a section of the town of, I should call it city of Jacksonville, Florida, where I was born. She settled in the Arlington neighborhood in Jacksonville. Auntie Jai Kingsley died at the age of 77. There's an unmarked grave. It's in the neighborhood of Arlington. We assume it to be hers. Every year, those of us who are descendants of Auntie and Zephaniah Kingsley, we gather at the Kingsley plantation. Most of us live in the United States and the Dominican Republic. We identify as white, black, Latino, and other. In 2018, the Senegalese government in Senegal and the royal Jai family hosted celebrations to mark a symbolic return of Auntie Jai. Indeed, a street was named for her in the town of Rusky. A few months ago, my niece, Perry Frances Fetch, a Spelman graduate, a seventh-generation descendant of the Kingsleys, was once again in Senegal, where our cousins warmly welcomed her. Now, how am I related to Auntie Jai and Zephaniah Kingsley? Here is how. Their great-granddaughter, Mary Frances Samus, better put, Mary Frances Kingsley Samus, married my great-grandfather, whose name was Abraham Lincoln Lewis. On March 29, 1865, Abraham Lincoln Lewis was born in Madison County, Florida, to Robert and Judy Lewis, who had recently been freed from enslavement. In 1876, along with his parents and his siblings, they moved to Jacksonville. There was said to be education there for black folks and better work than in Madison County, Florida. When he was 13 years old and in the 6th grade, in order to help to support his family, my great-grandfather, Abraham Lincoln Lewis, dropped out of school and began working in the local sawmill. He became very quickly the highest paid black worker in that sawmill. Years later, A.L. Lewis, and he always preferred to be called A.L. Lewis, not Abraham Lincoln Lewis. He would become a great champion of education for African Americans and a generous philanthropist in support of historically black colleges and universities. Among those that he supported in particular was Bethune-Cookman College, founded by his close friend. And indeed, one of the great joys I'm having now is reading the correspondence between A.L. Lewis and his bestie, Mary McLeod Bethune. He also supported Edward Waters College, which is an HBCU in our town of Jacksonville. He supported what is now a university, what was then Wilberforce College, my mother's alma mater. And it was Wilberforce College that granted him an honorary degree, and thus he was known as Dr. A.L. Lewis. And so I have shared with you that in 1884 in Jacksonville, A.L. Lewis and Mary Frances Kingsley Savage married. Well, I want you to know that they had one son. And it's important as you do your genealogy to say, as I will say, one son who survived. That son married Bertha Moody, and she became Lewis. They had 2 children, my uncle, James Leonard Lewis, and my mother, Mary Frances Lewis Bench. Now I want to share with you something that I consider to be extraordinary, that Fafa, the nickname that my sister and I gave to A.L. Lewis, something that Fafa did. In 1901, A.L. Lewis, now it's 39 years after the end of slavery, better put only 39 years after the end of enslavement. A.L. Lewis and 6 other black men in Jacksonville contributed $100 each to finance the founding of the first insurance company in the state of Florida. Not the first black insurance company, the first insurance company. It was A.L. Lewis who drew on his keen sense of his African heritage. This is a man who in 1937, and he had become a millionaire. In 1937, he and his second wife traveled by steamer from Jacksonville to Europe, to Egypt, to stand in front of the pyramids. A photograph of them is in our home, as indeed his desk is there, is one of the most priceless material possessions in my life. And so these black men started the Afro-American Industrial and Benefit Association. It was A.L. Lewis who named that company. Can you imagine? It's 1901. And he's naming a company, not the colored company, not even, as would become the progressive language, the Negro company. He named it the Afro-American Company. The company was affectionately called then the Afro. In addition to being a true race man, during that generation, there were race men and race women. My great-grandfather was a race man, like Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune was a race woman. That simply meant you believed in your people and you worked for their ultimate liberation. But in addition to supporting civil rights, A.L. Lewis was a philanthropist who honored what he taught me. I knew my great-grandfather. And yes, he had his own version of that saying in our community that goes like this: doing for others is just the rent you gotta pay for your room on earth. A.L. Lewis was also a man of deep faith. For over 50 years, he was a superintendent of the Sunday school of Mount Olive AME Church, more correctly said, church, where our family worshiped. Another expression of his Christian faith is that he instituted a practice that was this: every Friday afternoon, before the company closed for the weekend, everyone gathered in a particular place. And it was in that place that they had a devotional worship service. In 1935, when A.L. Lewis was the president of the Afro-American Life Insurance Company, he withdrew money from the Afro's Pension Bureau. And let me tell you what he did. With that money, he purchased 33 acres of property along the Atlantic Ocean. He did so, said he, so that employees of the company and their families could enjoy a beach community. And if they were able to do so, they could purchase land and build homes in that beach community. He named that beach community American Beach. You see, during that time, and I'm looking out and seeing that I am no doubt the elder here, so I got to tell you the other something. During that time, black people could not go to white people's beaches. Or black people had to make sure if they were going in the Atlantic Ocean at a beach, they did not cross over the side of an orange rope, which white folk had the nerve to say they could divide an ocean for white folk and for black folk. Sharing that with you will help you to understand why it is that in founding the American Beach community, my great-grandfather said it will be a place for recreation and relaxation without humiliation. My husband, who I'm so glad is here with me, James Stater, and I recently built our home in this American Beach community. In its heyday, American Beach was a thriving community where black people from across the state of Florida and beyond would come for a weekend, or after church on Sunday, or for an extended vacation. Famous musicians performed in what is still a building with the name of Evans Rendezvous. I'm talking about famous musicians like Cab Calloway and Billy Eckstine and James Brown, and well-known black people such as Zora Neale Hurston and Booker T. Washington spent time on the beach. In 1964, that horrible Hurricane Dora had a devastating effect on the American beach community. I can describe our community today as a place where there are abandoned homes and lots and mansions valued at more than $1 million. While most of the homes are still owned by black people, today American Beach is a racially mixed community. I want to give you a clear example of the unequal treatment that black folks on American Beach have experienced. You see, it is only now, in the year 2023. Remember, American Beach was founded in 1935. So 85 years have passed, and we are only now being prepared to have water and sewer. A preparation being made by the folk in Nassau County, Florida. I want to share with you something about my sister, born 18 months before I. Before my sister returned to Florida from spending years in Europe, she became an environmentalist. I can tell you there's a right whale named for her. She became an incredibly strong political activist who led the movement to save American Beach from the white developers. My sister was quite a character. When Ronald Reagan was elected president, she removed the aura from her given name. And in tribute to her African ancestry, she renamed herself Marvin Oshun for the Yoruba Orisha Betch. She became known as the Beach Lady, the person who gave the name Nam Nam to American Beach's dunes, the person who led the effort to make our Black Beach a National Historic Site. What a striking figure she was. My sister was 6 feet tall. She had one dreadlock from the top of her head to her feet. She had very long fingernails and regretted that a man who lived somewhere in Asia had fingernails just a wee bit longer than her. And therefore he is in the Guinness World Book of Records for the longest fingernails. She adorned herself with political buttons, her favorite of which she wore right on a piece of net on her forehead that said, "Save Mother Earth." Now, I was born a black cis girl, but as the great-granddaughter of A.L. Lewis, Florida's first black millionaire, clearly I was not born poor. However, in the segregated South of that time. And I am convinced that across America today, you've got to understand that race can never trump class. Here's an example of what I mean. When I was a youngster, in those days of legal segregation, because of who my family was, somebody at the department store downtown would call up my mother. And rather than using that disrespectful language that white folks love to use in addressing black women, hello, Annie, someone would say, hello, Mrs. Batch. We've just gotten some new dresses in to the store. Why don't you bring the girls down this evening and let them try on some of these new clothes? Well, I am here to testify that the day came, and I'm not sure if I was 10 or 11, but the day came when I said to my mother as respectfully as I could, Mama, if I cannot try on a dress in the light of day, I don't want to ever again try on a dress in the darkness of night. And that is how, as a youngster, I began my lifelong journey as a social justice activist. Here's another example of the racism my family experienced in the segregated city of Jacksonville, Florida. When I was a graduate student in anthropology at Northwestern University, I married Robert Cole, a white American graduate student in economics. On an occasion when my late husband came to Jacksonville to join me where I was visiting my family, this is the message that someone called and delivered to my mother when she answered the phone. This is the Ku Klux Klan. You better get that nigger lover out of your house or we're going to burn it down. My family was profoundly fortunate that this vile message turned out to be a threat rather than one of the hideous acts of violence the white segregationist, right-wing terrorist Ku Klux Klan committed during its reign of terror throughout the South. When my great-grandfather passed away in 1947, by the way, I do want to share that it was Dr. Mary McLeod Bethune who read the eulogy at his funeral. He willed his home to my mother. It was a home in a section of Jacksonville called Sugar Hill, where rich black folk lived. However, I must share with you that my mother repeatedly told me, my sister, and my brother, born 9 years after I, you need to remember it's your great-grandfather who's the millionaire, not us. But across from our home that had been A.L. Lewis's mansion, there was a beautiful park and a swimming pool. But because we were Black Americans, we could not swim in that swimming pool. Music and art were always important in my nuclear family. My mother was the pianist, the organist, and the choir director for all of the choirs at Mount Olive AME Church. After all, that was where our family worshiped. As a child, my sister was clearly a gifted musician, as a singer and a pianist. She went on, by the way, to be a double major in voice and piano at Oberlin Conservatory. And after Oberlin, she went to Europe, studying in Paris with the legendary Roland Hayes, before she went on to sing lead roles in German state opera. She sang the roles, the lead roles of Madame Butterfly. She sang other such roles. My brother, John Thomas Betch, is a jazz drummer, and he's also lived in Europe, doing so for 30 years in Paris. And before he recently returned home to Florida, he performed as a drummer our black improvisational music, and he did so all over the world. In the segregated city of Jacksonville, where my family lived, it didn't matter, as people would say, a hill of beans, that members of my family were musically talented. Because we were black, we could not go to the symphony. We could not go to the opera. We could not go to jazz clubs that belonged to white people. Now, my mother had not studied the visual arts, but she had what we museum people call the eye. She adorned our home on Sugar Hill with maybe a few works of original art. But our home was mainly adorned with reproductions of a few European and white American artists, and many reproductions done by, or many reproductions of the work of great black artists. And so it was in my own introduction to the world of art was not by going to museums. After all, I was not welcomed in the museums that white folks went to. It was in our home that I was introduced to and fell in love with works of great African-American artists. It's time now for me to move toward concluding this talk. And so I want to return to the central point I hope you will remember. It is this: stories and scholarly works about Black Americans, such as the stories I have just shared with you, these stories are now under attack. Not only in the state of Florida, where I live, but across our country. And so my sisters, my brothers, my siblings, all, we must defend the study of African American history and her story. We must work for the inclusion of our great art in the museums of our country and the world. And it is our right and our obligation to make sure that our people's culture is respected and protected. It will not surprise you that my final words of this talk are these. That kind of work is the work of the Weeksville Heritage Center. And I urge each of you to support this righteous work. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you.
At the same time, when I have a good doctor here, some things I would ask.
Okay.
He talked about, in order to get Dr. Gold here, we talked about a lot of what this could be, what we should be talking about. And I think it's incredible that you took it to such a personal part. Right there, your own story, which I actually never really knew or heard before. And did you say that this was one of the first things
I've told parts of the story, but I've never told the story in this way. And I know that it's really the first time that I've shared anything about the fraternal side of my family. In or on the beach, in the beach community that we live in now, there is the A.L. Lewis Museum, which is dedicated to telling the story of A.L. Lewis and the beach league and that early community.
Is there any reason why now?
Especially now. The museum has been there for a number of years, but like Weeksville, if ever we needed to tell our story, it is now. Forgive me if I'm sounding like an alarmist. I really am not. Our history, our art, our culture is under attack. And so we've just got to do what we've always done, and that is to push back. We need these?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, I promise, sister.
I mean, it's interesting because in telling your story, I was thinking you just telling your story like you just told it in the context of the attack on African American history and telling those stories is actually a very radical act. Just for us to be telling our stories is a radical act. And it's very much in line with Weeksville's history.
I like that language a lot. I like that language a lot, Brother President. It is a radical act. It is a political act to tell our story. But we have always had to be a radical people. Without being a radical people, how in the world would we have survived? So yes. And I do want to just say that today we came early enough so that my husband and I could have a tour of Weeksville. I can't tell you how deeply I am now attached to what this site is all about. And you, my sisters, my brothers, my siblings, you are in this community. You've got to continue to do all that is possible to support this work.
Thank you for that. And it was the contrast, actually the contrast with the consistency where it talks about setting up with communities in Florida, the establishment of the insurance company, which are all similar acts that were done in historic Weeksville. This idea around institution building, wealth, land acquisition, happens in Florida, happened in Brooklyn. So I mean, it's interesting that you brought up that history. And I actually didn't know that part of your history until we started talking. So I felt especially, I had a moment where it's like, well, we really made a good decision because we already had that built-in history. Not by coincidence, nothing happens by coincidence.
That's true, but I also want to say that while, for time, in the interest of time, I focused only on A.L. Lewis. There is an extraordinary history that is situated in Atlanta with the Atlanta Life Insurance Company, with the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Remember back in those days, white insurance companies would not insure us. And so when A.L. Lewis and those 6 men came together and founded in 1901 that insurance company, I gotta tell you, my brother, one day when I'm reading Hortense Powdermaker, forgive us, this is an anthropology moment, I'm reading Hortense Powdermaker in an anthropological book, or an anthropology book, about the practice of the susu in African villages, where each person would put in a little something so that when everyone would put in a little something, when somebody needed it, it would go to them. That was the principle that A.L. Lewis and those 6 men used to found that insurance company.
Jamaican people, if you know, either their partners, everybody, and shots.
Testify. There you go.
No, so thank you for bringing that home. So, I mean, what do you know, one of the things that's interesting is that it seems like things go in cycles, everything goes in cycles. It talks about the attack on African American history now. I'm sure you've seen this before. What would you say is there anything specific about this period now that's different than what's happened before?
I've been giving thought to that because, you know, back in the 1960s, I, with others, anything worth doing is never a single act. I'm a single person. But I, with others, started one of the first Black Studies programs in our country. And I did this at a place called Washington State University in Pullman, Washington. There was no language that I can remember hearing that is like what we are hearing now out of the mouths of the governors of Georgia and Florida and other places. I mean, this is different. This is different in the sense that it is so purposefully, and if we aren't careful, it will be effectively tied to a political agenda. When we were starting Black Studies back in the 60s, of course there were attacks. You know, and folk were saying, why do you need this? Just study, you know, American history. What is going on now, including the attacks on the LGBTQ community, that actually dares to say what teachers can and cannot teach? This calling for banned books. And this makes me think about South Africa. In those days when I was marching in the anti-apartheid movement. And I love to tell the story about one of the books that was banned in South Africa. The title of the book was Black Beauty. And those folk, those Afrikaners, couldn't imagine putting those two words together, black and beauty. Of course, if you know the story, Black Beauty was a story of a horse. But it shows you the insanity of systemic racism. Yes, I think this is different. It is so tied to a political agenda and a period in history, and this is what I think is also different, when the rise in the number of people of color is so substantial that on the far right, white supremacists are on a very determined track to put us down.
So you're an activist. history of social justice movements. Where do we go from here? What do we do?
That is the only question that we should all be answering right now. You know, doing what I just did is to tell the story, is to give the talk. But what is the responsibility of each of us? And I deeply believe you've got to find it. If you don't know it now, you got to find it. And one of the reasons I say that is not only because we need you in the struggle, we need you in the social justice activist struggle. But I want to tell you there's also, along with the hard work and the pain, there's joy. There's joy in being engaged in somehow making, even if it's teenage, or as the old folk used to say in Jacksonville, itsy bitsy in quantity, discovering what is your action. And it could be that it's reading to our children in a community center somewhere. It could be organizing around our rights as women to be in control of our own bodies. It could be going to school boards that are now saying what can and cannot be taught in school. It could be starting a petition about this or that. Whatever it is, just hear Ella Baker's words. Words that anybody in here know Sweet Honey in the Rock? Sweet Honey in the Rock took these words of the great Shiro, civil rights activist Ella Baker. They made a song of it. And it goes, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's done. So find something to do.
So on that note, we're in Weeksville, culture institution, arts, culture, education. What do you see the role of art and culture, not necessarily only Weeksville, but cultural institutions, museums, the sector, the field? What can we do as artists, people that support artists, that are interested in culture, to bring people together to look, feel, and engage with culture?
Well, you know, my bro, I wasn't in that line when the good Lord, she was giving out musical talent. I wasn't in that line when the good Lord, she was giving out the ability to be an artist. But I was fortunate to be around to fall in love with the visual arts. And as some of you know, ended up having the incredible privilege of serving as the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African Art. I thought I understood the power of art to describe, to explain, to push back, to, yes, incite action. But once I got into the world of museums in a professional way, it became so clear to me that the visual arts, yes, like dance, like music, like theater, the visual arts have an unusual power to both inform and to inspire. And so I'm particularly smitten by the fact that here at the Weeksville Heritage Center, work is being done that brings together history, art, and culture. As we did our little tour today, we went into the gallery. And though the entire exhibition was not up, at least we saw some of that hip-hop exhibition. And while that's not the genre that I'm particularly attached to, don't get me started about and misogyny. And while I am really into Black improvisational music, I understand the power of that art form. And so, whether you are, the recipient of talent or not, you can go to a museum. And if you can't get to a museum, you can bring it into your own home. And for those of you who are in the process of raising our children, I just have to make the plea that you find ways to adorn your homes with Black art. Just as you read Black stories to your children, they need to, as the old folk would say, with their own eyes, look at the works of Beard and Catlett. They need to be moved when they just look up and see reflections of themselves.
Well, thank you for being that person, for being in the position to be able to elevate and amplify Black art as you did at the Smithsonian and continue to do. And thank you for your work, just in general, around social justice, causes that mean a lot to us, but then being in the positions, putting yourself in positions, going out on in front, leading, framing the discussions, being a trailblazer. When I was reading your bio, all the different areas that you touched, that impact in, for me is very humbling, but at the same time very inspiring. So thank you for that. So on that note, I want to open the floor up to anybody who might have a question of Dr. Cole. I don't want this just to be a conversation between you and I. Want to engage both the folks at home and the folks here in the audience at Weeksville. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. And Erica's coming with a mic in 1 second so everybody can hear you.
I thank you so very much. And it's so amazing. The story.
My sister, are you on?
You're on it.
No. Erica, can you help
It's
us?
that one just a little low, just
Yes, I was amazed and it was just so beautiful. My question is, the research, did you do the research to find out about Cuba and Haiti and Santo Domingo, about your forefathers? Or was it told, was the story handed down?
That's a very good question. It's a bit of both. As I said, the works on Anta Majidjai, I mean, Google her. Google her. And it's somewhat overwhelming, the amount of published stuff. But I've also just taken a deep interest in understanding what my great, I remembered 6, grandmother went through. And I want to say again what I said in my prepared remarks. You know, not everything about Black history, in terms of what we were doing, is all nice and good stuff. I mean, you know, we have to acknowledge when we talk about enslavement, the role of African people in enslaving their own people.
Yes.
And telling the whole story really is our responsibility. Just as I told the story that Anta owned enslaved people. Now, I'm not a genealogist, but I'm here to tell you that you can do the very work you heard me talk about today. And I was just kind of waiting until I could say this. And my sister set me up, even though I didn't tell her to set me up.
One other thing I just want to say.
Sure.
My cousin and I just came back from Senegal.
Besides Dakar, where were you?
We were all over. We went to Gori, we went to the monument, which is amazing, and which was made in Korea. Yet it tells our story. And as you go into the museum, I encourage everyone to go into the museum of the monument, because every country in Africa contributed, and that was wonderful. But I just love your story, and I love that you encourage us to go to museums.
Well, I am glad you went to the place that I identify with the most. I've been very fortunate over the years being an anthropologist to have gone to 17 of the 54 countries. And I did my field work 2 years in Liberia. But I really want to say, you don't have to be a genealogist, you don't have to be a historian, and you sure don't have to be an anthropologist. You just have to have an interest. And I want to urge you to use this convening tonight to think about recording, beginning to record your own history and her story. There is a grandma, there's an auntie, there's an uncle, there's a grandpa who may at first say, oh child, I don't have time to be sitting around telling those stories. But you can find a way with that little recorder to begin to ask those questions. You can find a way to go on, what is it, JD? Ancestry.com, to begin to find out, where did you come from? It's a journey worth taking. And you got a genuine regulation official anthropologist who one day, if you find them, you can say, bro, show me how to do a kinship chart. And he's going to show you how to make little circles and little triangles. And you're going to start, and you're going to go back as far as you can. And you are going to begin to own your own story. It's a very powerful experience.
I don't have a question, but I want to share something.
Please.
In 1974, I was 8 kid, and my family's been in Weeksville since the 30s. And I went to PS 243. This was before it was Weeksville. And I joined this competition that was sponsored by the artist, Joan Maynard, and the different activists. And the competition was to draw Weeksville homes, because it was the first time it became Weeksville, and be a part of this archaeological dig. So I was an artist digging in lots as a little boy here in this community. And it created the person that is standing in front of you. It's so emotional to me, that I was drawn to this talk. I just looked online really quickly, but I've had projects with Weeksville in the past, in the museum here itself. But my whole life mission now, as I'm sharing, is to tell stories as a result of that experience. So my project now is to archive and create stories in the communities around me. So this is, I went in this, I came here blindly not knowing anything, and it's exactly where I needed to be. So I want to share.
Work. That's the work.
No, so we're gonna get your oral history.
Well, my grandmother was Minnie Bird, who's, she was 90, and a few years ago, she was one of the first archives to have oral history here in the museum. So it's probably it's here now, but mine isn't a part of it yet.
It's gonna be.
But I think the point that you brought up around, you don't have to have formal training. You don't have to have all the tools.
Exactly.
Now you can literally pick up a phone and talk to a relative, parent, grandparent, auntie, uncle, what have you. So the idea, I think, the idea around just recording it, getting it down, don't see technology or training as a barrier. It's more important to get the story and record it, and keep recording, keep asking, and keep telling the story like you said. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Very inspiring.
My sister, way in the back, stand up and tell us what's on your mind.
Ashe, thank you, beautiful, for this conversation. I wanted to ask, how do we preserve the sanctity of our archival work in regards to outside entities, corporations that are non-Black museums, such as those we have worked with, instead of taking them themselves and giving them the promotion that a lot of times is not retained in our own communities directly? And also in connection with that question, how do we also preserve it to where it continues down our lineages, to where it doesn't get lost? Like, this may not be the facts, but from what I was taught about the books of the Bible is that they were assembled, and that there are many other books that may still be in other countries and areas or deeply buried somewhere. So just like with our stories, how do we make sure they continue to last throughout time, but without being in the hands of vultures who aren't reflective of who we are and control our narrative after we release it into the world?
It's a very serious question. You're talking about the appropriation of our lives. And as many of you know, there is now in the museum world a struggle to get our works of art that were stolen during the periods of colonialism and imperialism were stolen. If you go to the British Museum, if you go to the Louvre, if you go to museums here in New York City, they got our stuff. And in fact, as many of you may know, if you've been reading this, the Metropolitan Museum of Art is now under enormous scrutiny for bringing into that museum illicitly acquired stuff that belongs to other people. And so it's a real issue. You know, I have to say this. After all, I can't leave without doing it. One of the most extraordinary moments in that film was addressing exactly what you're talking about. And while the stealing of the great bronzes of Benin is something almost anybody ought to be able to say, that just was not right. I would argue that it is no less criminal to distort in a scholarly publication the history and her story about people. It's criminal. And I would say now, all of these acts to stop the teaching, the scholarly stories and the lived experience of Black people is criminal. So how do we protect it? By becoming the scholars ourselves. That's how we protect it. And if scholarship isn't your thing, then from wherever you are, stand in support of the authentic history of Black people and of any people. Well, if I about wore y'all out? No. All right, please, my sister.
So, again, but when you were talking about the attempt to erase Black history from the education system, it took me to a moment, literally last night, where I remembered this small fact about Harriet Tubman, and my wife was like, how in the world did you know this? And it was from a comic book that my parents forced me to read when I was a kid.
Wow.
You know my parents, they were oppressed, and I was forced to read all of these stories. Like, all of my books had to be Black books growing up. And I felt quite traumatized growing up, to the point that I say, I'm sick of reading about slavery, I'm sick of reading, I'm sad. But at this point now, I can tell you, I can remember these small little facts that were never taught in college. I didn't learn them honestly until I got to Spelman. I had Black history in high school, all of that, but I didn't learn these important small little things that were affirming until I got to, this Spelman and then beyond. But I just say that to say that we should also think about, when you talk about the arts, about books, and about children's books, and what we take in when we're younger. I think we do retain that, even if we don't think about it, we don't want to think about it, but then we do. Remember, I would just say, think about the art that you surround your children with, like you said, and the books that you surround your children with.
What is the small fact you remember?
That Harriet Tubman was the herbalist.
Yeah, I am going to put a plug in.
Yes, please do.
I'm going to put in a plug. I am now deeply interested in children's books. I think it may be the most sneaky, revolutionary that you can engage in.
Yes.
I did publish my first children's book. It is entitled African Proverbs for All Ages. And it is done with just an extraordinarily gifted illustrator who unfortunately went to glory recently, but not before she knew that our book was not only published, and we had done some book signings, and she knew that we had won a major award for the book. What's very important, we think, about the book is this is the first children's book that has ever received the Oprah Winfrey stamp for our book club. And the story is, I'll tell it ever so quickly. The illustrator of the book, Nelda Lateef, had asked me to blurb one of her books, and I had, and so we connected and decided to do this book together because I'm just really into African proverbs and African American sayings and proverbs of any people. And once we had gathered the proverbs from around the continent, she started on my case and she said, you know Oprah Winfrey, so, blurb our book. And I kept saying, Oprah doesn't know books. She kept saying, well, okay, well, just get her to look at the book. And she would not stop. So finally, just to get her off my case, I sent online, electronically, the manuscript of the book to Miss Winfrey. And I asked her if she would help us get it published. I said, Sister O, I've never published a children's book. Could you help? So she writes back and she says, I really have no idea about how you get a children's book published, but I love your Proverbs. And so I thought, well, at least I got that. That's not bad. 2 weeks later, Miss Winfrey sent a note saying, you should contact this publishing house. So Nelda Lateef and I packaged up all of stuff, sent it off electronically to Macmillan Publishing House's children's section, children's house, book publishing house called Roaring Press. And they instantly loved the Proverbs. So now I'm on the roll.
You made that seem easy.
Huh?
You made that seem easy.
No, it wasn't easy. And publishing ain't easy, and you can testify. But one of my students, his name is Bege Langa. He was a African National Congress freedom fighter and had to leave South Africa. Teaches now at Edward's University. But he is a wonderful collector of African, in particular, South African proverbs. And so we are now committed to doing a book of South African and African American proverbs. And what excites me about this is I'm sure as I look at and feel the sisters and brothers, my siblings in this space, you know that long connection between South Africa and African Americans, the parallel in our struggles. Well, our proverbs are going to help us to relive some of all of that. So, again, and I'm going to just say it with all the strength that I've got, if you want to really be a revolutionary and you got some children, read them good children's books.
Dr. Cole and Dr. Carrington, actually, may I hop in and bring in our online audience really quickly because we have some folks with some questions here as well. Thank you. So A.B. Brown, first of all, also the online audience is riveted. I just want you to know that everyone is very much enjoying hearing you speak and everything that you're talking about. A.B. Brown would like to know, what advice would you give to young people who are interested in pursuing careers in academia, activism, or social justice?
Do it. And I love the question because it put up a threesome. Sister Erica, give those three things one more time.
We got academia, activism, and social justice.
That's it. In fact, I would say that's kind of the way the brother president and I define ourselves. Now, some people use fancy language and they talk about a public intellectual, which is a good way of saying, don't give all that gobbledygook. Can you just say it in straight English? Could you say what your work is about and do it in language that people can understand? But I've always believed that there are two things that a well-educated person has got to do. And the first is to learn more about him or her or themselves and their people and their world. But the second is to figure out what's your role in helping to make the world better. And so I can't see a separation between the academy or schooling and social justice. What else you got for us?
We got one more, and then I'll let...
One follow-up point to that is, I think one of the things that has come up, and I'm sitting there thinking about you and the generations of anthropologists, that are before us and the scholars and activists that are before us is that, finding mentors, linking with people that, I don't say run interference for you, but there are a lot of people that went before me, including yourself, that showed a path, how to navigate academia, how to navigate the museum world. So I was watching you and like watching what you're doing and trying to emulate. So I think the importance of really linking up, finding your community, finding people that can support you, finding mentors. It doesn't always work like that, like so easily, but at the same time, finding people that you see out there that are doing the kind of work that you want to do, linking up with them, trying some of the things that they're doing. That really helped me come along, because you were the trailblazers, you were the people that were coming after you. You were trying to do what you were doing, but you were also demonstrating, like, this is how it's done, this is how I go through this Smithsonian, this is how I made it as a university president. So whenever you're out in the public eye, people are constantly watching you and trying to really figure out how it's done. So I think it's important for us to be accessible. You're about as accessible as it comes. I mean, I came to you probably as a early grad student, introducing myself and asking you questions, and you're probably like, who is this? But you never turned me away. You always responded and were very generous with your time. So anybody in that position, please continue to know that people are watching. People do need mentors. People do need networks, because that's the other side of this, is how you actually get it done, how you get in places to make change. So, yeah.
Another from A.B. Brown, and I love this type of question. I think I might have an idea of how you're going to answer it. But looking back on your life and career, is there something you would have done differently?
Yes. The thing that I wish I had done far, far, far earlier in my life was to take better care of my health.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I sit here now, and you can see me on supplemental oxygen, I am getting to be a preacher about self-care. And I am going to share with you, and I know our time is short, but I want to share with you these words of Audre Lorde. Do you know anybody here who knows Audre Lorde? And I'm going to tell you. Audre Lorde, a Caribbean woman, a black woman, a woman who was and forever will be one of the best known black lesbian, these would be her words, mother, professor, poet, warrior, said this about self-care. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation. It is a political act. We've got to take care of ourselves. And while this is something that folk of whatever gender identity need to be engaged in, black women in particular, we've got to take better care of ourselves. We always take care of everybody else. I mean, sometimes I think, we walk into a room and we say, oh, that poor chair, I bet it feels lonely. I'm just going to go and sit there and take care of that chair. If we don't take care of ourselves, we really can't take care of others. So, self-care is what I wish I had engaged in much earlier in my life, and specifically, what was I doing in graduate school? Smoking like a chimney and developing the kind of compromised lungs now that have finally caught up with me. And so, regardless of what your age is, you're younger than I am. I'm begging you, self-care.
Sylvia, and then
First of all, thank you so much for being here. Second of all, today
slavery in slavery. And one of the things they said they were going to do is put on a number of their churches, the churches that were actually built with slave labor. And then the other thing they said they were going to do was to establish a fund. The amount is hopefully it'll grow, but $1 million fund to do grants and different things. So my question to you had to do with this whole notion of reparations. Because I think one of the key issues of resistance to critical race theory is this idea of we don't want to take responsibility. We don't want our kids to feel bad to think that it's not just American exceptionalism that has created this great wealth, but it's the fact that we have used these people, slaves, for 400 years plus, that you had a company that you had people working for you for free for 400 years, yeah, you're going to have a pretty big corporation. So I just wanted to know your thoughts on reparations and this whole issue of racial apology and how it relates to this whole notion of moving critical race theory forward, which is one of the topics that you touched on.
Well, first I want to thank you so much, dear sister on the board,
Yes, ma'am.
for sharing that. And I must take a moment of personal engagement to say that we are Palians, my husband and I. We are Episcopalians. And so this means an enormous amount to us. If you can't own it, you can never fix it. And whenever I think about the necessity for apologies and the correctness of reparations, I think about James Baldwin. And I think about his words that said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that is not faced. And so until my country, my ancestors helped to build it, until my country owns its profound engagement in the brutal acts of enslavement, we're not going to really be able to make this work. And enslavement followed by those years and years that continue of systemic racism. So I think what the Episcopal Church did today is a righteous act. May it encourage other denominations to do no less.
Hi, how are you? My name is Yusta and I am from Tanzania. So storytelling is a craft. I love storytelling. And what you presented, you just took us back. And like I envisioned, like I was there, I was part of that experience. But it's a difficult craft. How did you build the craft of storytelling? And did you pick it up from your parents? Or how can we also be able to pick up the story of storytelling so we could be able to continue sharing those stories that are very immersive?
Oh, first of all, my dear sister from Tanzania, I love your question because with you, I own the power of storytelling. And while we sometimes make this special acquired gift or act or process, anybody can tell a story. And one of the most, I think, beautiful ways to see storytelling is to watch children play. And this one says, so I'm going to be a grasshopper, and you will be a bumblebee. So let's start having a race. And then we'll see who wins the race. That's the beginning of a story. We, I think, as human beings, tell our stories. Remember those centuries and centuries and centuries when we couldn't write our stories, we told them. And our people on that great continent from which you and your folk have come so directly. Storytelling is a fundamental African process. It is those griots who have made it possible for us to know so much of the history and her story, and even prehistory, because it is they who told the stories when it wasn't being written down. And so, just start. Just start. Our brother here is all fired up. I mean, he is going to tell his story that is chiseled into this Weeksville community. And so one of the ways that maybe you break into this, because now we are so high-sedity, you know, we have gotten ourselves so educated. Get yourself a journal. Start journaling. And start writing the story. And then, next thing you know, it sounded good. And maybe after dinner, you decide you're gonna sort of have the journal, but basically, you're just gonna sit and with your family members begin to tell a story. Just as our sister did about the way that her very prominent parents figured out how to start the process of giving her a good Black education by telling the stories. Once you get into it, you'll never get back out of it. It's addictive. Tell your story.
You are good at it. Anybody we haven't heard from?
It's more of a, I guess, a comment, but from hearing everyone's comments as well as their questions, it just tied back to your point of like, how do we kind of fight back against our current legislation that's trying to make sure that we're not learning about our own history. But I think it's a part of like, our culture is both something that we enjoy, but also the tools that we like use to fight back against that. So it is the part of telling the story or like talking on the phone or asking, you know, your parents whatever questions about their past. Like that's the archival, that's the memory, that's that memory that we need to continue to like push forward. It's the children's books that's teaching. It's this that's like convening and it's creating community. So these things that we kind of just I guess, grapple with every day becomes like this tool and this like radical tool that we can then use to push back. But I was just thinking, I watched the Toni Morrison documentary that's on Netflix, The Pieces I Am. She said something about her writing. She always wanted to make sure that it didn't have the white audience like at its forefront. It was about showing that Black people have a lived experience outside of these spaces. And I think this is something that shows that, like, yes, we have to navigate this, like, white world that we're in. That's just the world that we live in. But as we continue to do things like this, or something as simple as just, like, being with our own family or with our own friends, like, we don't necessarily realize what we're creating in that space. And this might be all over the place, but I just wanted to share that because this is what that conversation has done for me, or has amplified for me.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
We have one more question. Let's get the last question.
Thank you. What's your most profound memory up until this point of all the work you have engaged in and contributed to? And upon your transcendence, what do you want to leave as a final work with the rest of the generation that is to come, the one that is here, and in memory of those that were here and are still in continuance?
Well, it's a question that is inevitably going to be asked of someone who has reached the age that I've reached, that has done at least some work. And I will probably surprise you when I tell you that
You're not done yet.
But when I tell you this, I'm really quite serious. Some work that I am intensely proud of is being the mom of 4 feminist sons. Three of these sons I grunted out, I birthed. The 4th I wonderfully acquired through marriage in our blended family. But while these are not perfect men, I haven't seen any perfect men or perfect women or perfect folk of any gender identity. They are feminist. And what I mean by that is very simply that they believe in the fundamental equality of those of us who identify as women and those who identify as men. Now think how revolutionary this is. Imagine if every black woman raised feminist sons. We could change the world. When I go off, I trust the glory. What do I want to be remembered by? It's just very hard to be original or creative. You know, it's much easier just to say, well, like one of my sheroes, Dorothy Irene Height said, great civil rights, women's rights activists, who for so many years was in the leadership position, the helm of the National Council of Negro Women. She said, you know, I want to be remembered as somebody who tried. That's a very powerful statement. You know, maybe you didn't accomplish everything you set out to do, but did you try? So I think I'm going to leave it with my shero.
Thank you for that. And yes, you are still here.
Yes.
We'll keep it in the present.
Right.
Just last thing from me, I'm just curious, how do you feel about the future? Are you optimistic?
Absolutely.
All right.
I mean, I strongly feel that the greatest enemy we have right now is hopelessness. How dare we give up? How dare we assume that we cannot make things better? And so I am optimistic for that youngster over there, for my own grandchildren, for those not even imagined. We just got to do the work.
Thank you.
I think your husband is a feminist.